Okay, that's great. Good evening, everyone. My name is Professor Joan Lockery, and I am head of the School of Law here at Queen's. You are all very welcome here this evening on this rather chilly night before snow, possibly. And it's very much my privilege to open the proceedings here this evening and to welcome you all to the Stephen Livingstone Lecture 2022. We're joined this evening online by Stephen's partner, Karen, and on behalf of the law school, I extend a particularly warm welcome to her. Unfortunately, Stephen's parents, Max and Flo, and his sister Alyson are not able to be with us tonight, but we do send them our thoughts and good wishes, and they're very much in our minds. Now, a bit of background about the Livingstone Lecture, which I'm sure a number of you are aware of, but maybe not all. Stephen was Professor of Human Rights Law here at Queen's, and he was head of the law school between 2000 and 2003. In this annual lecture, the school honours and celebrates his life and his work, and particularly his commitment to advancing human rights as both an academic and as an activist. Stephen's passion for human rights was deeply symbiotically rooted in their practical expression. His research was informed by his experiences of their application in the US, Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, and South Africa, and the experiences and insights contributed to the depth and success of his work. He was, I am told by those who knew him and who were fortunate enough to have known him and to have worked with him and to have been friends with him, a gifted colleague, a great friend, an approachable boss, and a great Spurs fan, so I'm told. By this lecture, as a school, we come together, not just colleagues who knew Stephen well, a number of whom are in the room this evening, but also those who are newer to the school, to remember him and to honour and to continue his legacy in the School of Law. This legacy is reflected most clearly in the ongoing commitment to the practice of human rights, which still characterises, and long may it continue, much of the scholarship in this school, and will certainly characterise tonight's lecture. We're very pleased to be joined by Alyson Kilpatrick. Alyson and her work will need very little introduction to those of you in this room, but she will get an introduction. My colleague, Professor Chris McCrudden, I'll invite him up to introduce our distinguished guest. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Joan. But before introducing our speaker, I think it's appropriate not only to recognise Stephen, but also it's appropriate at this time to commemorate Edgar Graham, Queen's Law lecturer and Ulster Unionist Assembly member, who was assassinated yards from here by the IRA 39 years ago yesterday. So our speaker this evening, as Joan said, Alyson Kilpatrick, who's been Chief Commissioner of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission since September 2021, when she was appointed to the post by the then Secretary of State, Brandon Lewis. Alyson, of course, studied here at Queen's and then at the College of Europe in Bruges. She's a qualified barrister, as many of you know. And before her current position, she had an extensive practice in human rights litigation, but also heavily involved in advising several public bodies on human rights issues, particularly in the area of policing and criminal law. Between 2009 and 2017, Alyson was the human rights advisor to the Northern Ireland Policing Board, following a certain Keir Starmer, I think. Whatever became of him, I wonder. In 2016, she was appointed special legal advisor to the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, and this continued until September 2021. Alyson was appointed to carry out an independent review of ECHR compliance of a number of Northern Ireland legacy investigations, known as Operation Canova. But her work's not confined to the UK. In 2018, Alyson conducted, on behalf of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties and the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, an independent human rights inspection of An Garda Síochána. And as if this was not enough, She's also undertaken significant and extensive work with the community and voluntary sector here. Until November 2017, she was chair of the board of the Simon community in Northern Ireland, member of the board of the One Safe Place Family Justice Centre, and vice chair of the board of the Northern Ireland Co-Ownership Housing Association. In short, there can be few more fitting or indeed more welcome speakers in honour of Stephen Livingstone. So Alyson, welcome back to Queen's. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Let's just balance my notes first. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the introduction. I'm absolutely thrilled to be doing this lecture, the Stephen Livingstone lecture. I'm really flattered that someone thought I might actually be equal to the task, because not only was Stephen an inspiration to me while studying for my undergraduate degree, he was more than a little help during the early fumblings of my professional career, and he's continued to have an influence ever since. And I would like to begin, if you'll indulge me, by giving a little bit of a personal recollection of Stephen and share the fact that I doubt I would be standing here giving any lecture, let alone this one, without him. I don't know if he wants to take credit for me, but he certainly kept me in the law more than once. First, as a young undergraduate, student, disillusioned, I wondered, could I ever get a law degree, let alone help people? And that was my very pretentious aim. And I kept being told I was being very pretentious, and I probably was. Before starting, I thought law was going to be this great adventure, and I would be sitting in dark, smoke-filled rooms, my legs crossed, probably wearing black, talking about philosophy of law, and turning up the next day and having a wonderful new thought about legal philosophy or some such, and stunning my lecturer. That's what I thought from the TV, because that was my only point of reference. But the reality was very different when I got there. So I was struggling to get through my weekly reading lists. I didn't get invited to any dark rooms for debate or otherwise. And I was crippled by nerves. I became more and more resigned to the fact that I would never become a practicing lawyer. There was no way, I thought, could I find the courage to speak in public. No way would I have the strength to stand up to other lawyers or judges. I was unlikely to support myself, let alone help others. That was until I had a chat with Stephen Livingstone. So I had no idea what to do. I thought I'd made the wrong choice. Stephen wasn't very much older than me, so I thought I'd maybe try him. And also I had served him drinks at the Belfast Festival Guinness spot, enjoying some jazz and blues. So he seemed approachable and he tipped me very well. So I went to him, explained my predicament. And what he did, which changed, I think changed my whole experience of Queen's, was he didn't interrogate me. He didn't give me a lecture or career advice. He asked me about Arsenal Football Club, and not entirely random. I did have a Gunner's key ring in my hand as I was talking to him. But he spent maybe, I don't know, 45 minutes talking about Frank Stapleton was my favourite, which gives away my age. And he wanted to know what I thought of Spurs' recent acquisition, Ozzy Ardiles. And while I wasn't prepared for this conversation, it did take away my nerves. And what he managed to do was get me to talk about what mattered to me. Talked on about football, a bit about Detroit Blues, asked me why I first thought of doing law. And when I told him, and I'm not going to tell you, but when I told him, it seemed to amuse him. And he said, I think you might have chosen okay, but you do need to grow up a bit. And the message he left me with, though, more importantly, probably, and what I stick with today, is you're no use to anyone if you don't actually know the law, and you're no use as a lawyer if you don't want to help people. And that really has, and I don't want to exaggerate, but that really has steered my career to date. It's those two things in parallel, I think, which Stephen told me were important. And he finished, this was what he left me with for the next 3 years. I paraphrase, but only very slightly. Wise up and try to put your expensive education to some use. And I think that sort of says a lot about Stephen. He said, that's how he sent me off. Ploughed on, finished my degree, my vocational qualification. And apart from a few sort of inspirational to me, probably didn't remember to Stephen, over the next few years, usually over a drink, the next significant point contact was when I had to finish off my professional qualification by doing pupillage in London. Now, I might not surprise you that I was still at that stage a little unprepared and not at all polished, but I was applying to quite famous chambers, which then were called civil liberties chambers. And I was competing against really impressive candidates with these amazing CVs who'd seemed the last 10 years just building up for this application. When I was I got an interview, surprisingly, but when I was interviewed, I didn't have an awful lot to talk about. I hadn't been to Uganda. I hadn't done anything particularly special. And the interview went very dry. They started asking me about Belfast. They asked me if I knew Stephen Livingstone, the interviewer. I said I did, and that he had encouraged me to apply, which was almost entirely correct. He'd said apply to the chambers, so he didn't tell me to go to that one. But I got the pupillage, to everyone's surprise, including the rest of the people in that chambers. But what I heard after the event from my interviewer was that he was a huge fan of Stephen's, having worked with him, and thought that if I knew him and liked him, I might just have something to offer. And he also loved Belfast, it turned out. He had, in his words, a blinding night with Stephen in the Queen's common room. I've had one of those. I think I was blinded rather than a blinding night. That's maybe enough. I think I've indulged enough with nostalgia, but it isn't just sentiment that I'm trying to share with you. Stephen's approach to law, I think, encapsulates a human rights approach, which is an approach that can deliver effective protection to everybody in every aspect of life. And most importantly, it can protect those people who are otherwise silent, marginalized, or what we used to call just plain downtrodden. I studied law in the 80s when human rights were more usually called civil liberties, started practice in the 90s when human rights were a thing, but they weren't very practical. So we sort of had to learn about them, but wasn't much we could do with them. And I was also there then in the noughties, running from one London court to the next, trying to understand the Human Rights Act, trying to apply it, trying to encourage judges to do the same. What it promised, and at that stage was still very tenuous, but what it promised was giving everyone a handful of rights enforceable, whether in the Willesden County Court, the Old Bailey, or before the employment tribunals. And I raised human rights. I went around a lot of courts in London. I raised human rights grounds, I think, in every one. Sometimes with great success, sometimes not so much. But each time I was sure, and I remain sure to this day, that the Human Rights Act had a very positive impact on each individual case, even if it didn't play a part in the actual final judgment, but also on how courts saw the people in front of them, me and my clients. If I had any criticism then, it was that human rights were not as far reaching as I might have hoped. So for example, some of the work I did was in the field of housing and homelessness. And the Human Rights Act meant for the first time that a court couldn't just be satisfied that a landlord had title to a property and wanted his tenant out. The court had to be satisfied before a person could be evicted from their home that it was necessary, proportionate measure. It didn't, however, provide, and still doesn't, the right to a home. So there are still some limits. As an older, more realistic, even maybe, I don't know, maybe a little bit tired as a lawyer, I think that's probably is the right balance now. I think the courts have worked their way through it, given in particular the relevance of rights such as to be free from torture, inhuman degrading treatment, and the right to respect for family, private life, personal integrity, etc. Those are still in the mix and can give rise to greater obligations, even in relation to housing. So you can actually find a way into a house using human rights, but primarily it protects the home you already have. The way human rights developed in this field certainly was that courts, having cases before them, hearing all of the evidence and legal argument, would weigh the various factors before reaching a decision. And in the housing possession case, for example, that included the rights of the often vulnerable occupier. And I tended to be for the occupier. Landlords didn't tend to instruct me quite as regularly. But also, and I think this is important, the neighbours, the landlord, and of wider society in need of housing. It's not always black and white. There's often other interests that have to be weighed in the balance, and judges are really good at doing that with facts in front of them and real people in front of them. And in my view, this application of the Human Rights Act is the most practical application of the law because it permits judges within democratically established boundaries to get to the heart of a case and, to use common parlance, do the right thing. It allows that flexibility while making it absolutely clear where the boundaries are. I think it's a beautiful thing in the law. And it fits very much with certainly what I learned from Stephen, but also what I hear from those people who knew him even better. It's got to be practical. If it's not, what's the point? what someone said to me recently about human rights is they changed their mind. I think they've been reading too many short quotes or being on Twitter too much, but they said, firstly, I now accept the law is not an ass. I know where they got that one from. It's not theoretical, and it certainly isn't blind to the human condition or the needs of society. Now, this person was somebody who, even 2-3 weeks previous, probably wouldn't have thanked you even for themselves having human rights, let alone other people. And this is exactly, I discovered, human rights law applied in courts was exactly how Stephen told me the law could be, and that was exciting. However, I picked my title for this evening, inspired as it was by Stephen and his absolute belief in universal human rights, his visceral understanding that marginalized people need others to fight for them, and that human rights aren't worth a damn if they don't make a difference to people's lived experience. He was right then and still is. But I picked the title knowing that that couldn't really be said with any good conscience at the moment. I've had, I only realized recently, I think, just how privileged I was to see up close two of the great institutions set up pursuant to the Good Friday Agreement. Very privileged seat watching human rights in action and on duty. First, as has been said, as the independent advisor to the Northern Ireland Policing Board, and now with the Human Rights Commission. A certain young lawyer, Keir Starmer, did precede me and left me all his old notes, which were no use whatsoever. Apparently, he's doing something quite important now in politics. But both those jobs are, and I think it's important for anyone who hasn't done the jobs, and there are very few people in this country who have. They're unusual, they're bizarre at times, always fascinating, hugely challenging, but they can leave you very isolated and exposed. And human rights can be divisive still in Northern Ireland. So we need to protect, I think, people who are working in these jobs. The work wasn't difficult in so much the analysis of the law. Bryce may correct me now when I think that was almost the easy bit. I probably got it wrong plenty of times. It was more and this is the same with Human Rights Commission now, and also all the work I did with housing and homelessness, for example, domestic violence, etc. It's the practical realization of rights protection for the most vulnerable, which is the most challenging, and making that practical protection effective for everybody is so difficult, I think, at times that many people just give up. And I have this awful fear at the minute that we collectively, from government to those working on the ground, are giving up a little, hence my title. And it is understandable because times are really hard, and those that should know better are telling us that this human rights stuff is at best too expensive and at worst undemocratic and dangerous. I dispute that. I hope it's obvious. But that's more than that. It's that sort of scaremongering is expensive, undemocratic and dangerous. And I don't speak from the position of a wide-eyed idealist, at least not anymore. I speak from the position of someone who has seen, as I say, up close and personal in the most real circumstances you can imagine, just what adherence to human rights has done for us as a society, and why we must care desperately about what is happening now. So I started at the policing board at the end of 2008. Justice had been devolved. Sinn Féin had taken their seats in the policing board, making up the full complement. National security primacy had been transferred away from the PSNI to Security Service, MI5, but supposed to have been brought in the remit of the policing board. New Chief Constable was taking over from Sir Hugh Ord. The police ombudsman had some very stark warnings about human rights breaches in the past, and the debate about the past continued to rage. The Human Rights Commission had issued its Northern Ireland Bill of Rights advice, and it looked almost certain that that was to be ignored. I felt that while this was an exciting place to be, and I really could make a contribution, I had a niggling feeling that I was coming in at the tail end of a great wave of positivity, celebration, and hope. And before I go any further, perhaps I could just say, in case I sound like a broken record, I don't want to keep talking about policing and criminal justice, because the danger in that is that it distracts us into believing that's all human rights are about, and that's what often divides people. Instead, we need to be clear, human rights are about every aspect of life from birth to death. I'd love to be here, concentrating on the exciting opportunities for human rights to prove their worth in practical scenarios, to talk about equality in health, housing, education, reproductive rights, for example. We're doing all those things at the Commission, or at least we're trying to. And there are real opportunities if we push on, but I keep being pulled back to policing. And most recently, that's because at the same time as police in Great Britain, many services should probably be undergoing their own style of pattern commission. They're being urged to reject human rights approaches entirely, to take the figurative gloves off. The debates in GB always reach us here, so this is something we should also be hugely worried about. The public are discussing the issue. They're discussing what's required to restore public confidence in policing and the rule of law. They're asking to what standards are the police to be held. They're wondering how those standards can be enforced, and questioning to whom the police answer individually and collectively if they fail to meet the standards set. When those questions were asked in Northern Ireland by the Independent Pattern Commission, the signal answer was by adoption of a human rights approach to policing. And thereafter, huge work and effort went into it by some of the people sitting in this room this evening. Government, however, presently are indicating their intentions by persistent talk of woke policing. And in case in any doubt, that used to be something very recently, it seemed to me that was something that was positive to say about a person, but it definitely isn't a compliment anymore. But what is happening is they're attributing a lot of society's ills to, for example, police chiefs who are too woke. They're alleging that police prefer to dance the Macarena at pride events than catch criminals. And what was, I think, intended on that occasion as a beautiful expression of community with people who are at greater risk was twisted into a threat to our collective safety. And there's something quite dark about that, because the underlying message is that human rights and public safety are in an inverse relationship, that we can have one or the other, but never both. Now, as amusing as it can be, and I do have fun sometimes going onto Twitter looking for things to be annoyed about, a lot of the messaging is actually deeply damaging to collective safety. That's what's damaging to the state, to the police, and damaging to the public's perception of universal rights. And it's very circular. One only ever diminishes the other. To give a flavour of what I'm talking about and why I've been pulled back to talk about policing again this evening, not long ago, but then Home Secretary Priti Patel told police chiefs to forget about all the nonsense, and I quote, "get back to basics." And I pause there simply to say, Chris Patten looked at policing, and he found with his expert panel that the basic job of the police was protecting human rights. And that's what his report was essentially all about. And I agree with him. Various media outlets, always difficult to know who starts it, but they're complaining that woke police chiefs are failing the public. And even our new Prime Minister, in the midst of many domestic and global crises, has set his sight on woke cops as he quote, I quote, ramps up the fight against crime. And I'll just say, see above, Chris Patten and numerous police chiefs I'm going to come on to briefly. I've heard all this before. I heard it at the start of my time in the policing board and throughout, really, and since. It ebbs and flows, these sort of debates, but there is something different now. I think now I've been away from the policing board for a few years, but I still pay close interest. And this anti-human rights narrative, this woke talk of policing, is now with such vengeance that I fear it actually might stick this time. Not least because it's not just words, we now have proposed legislation to give effect to it. So going back to my time at the policing board, I saw some of these so-called woke officers in the classroom, in planning rooms and on the streets. I saw their decision-making behind closed doors, even in the very complicated world of covert policing and authorizations, etc. I saw them on the street during tense public order operations. Their training and conversations might now be called woke, it might fall into this people are trying to get rid of, but that's not what I saw or heard. What I saw and heard was a group of professional people who understood they were there to protect everyone from crime. And the best way they'd learned to do that was through the decision-making, and that's what they saw it as, a decision-making framework required by the Human Rights Act. They translated the law into practical steps which had become instinctive to them. They managed scenarios differently with a reduction in harm to everyone, including themselves. And I do worry that if we remove that framework of the Human Rights Act, on which 25 years worth of police officers have been trained, I wonder what's going to be there in its place. Now I'm going to share, if I may, just one live incident with you. And it's one that I think certainly stayed with me. I ended up seeing a lot more of these sorts of incidents, but this was one that really stayed with me. I was in a command room, Silver Command, which is where the real operational decision-making happens. It was brimming with police officers. They were exhausted. They'd been going all day. Some of them, when they came back for the breaks, smelt of petrol. They were soaking wet. Information was flooding into the command room from many different sources, including intelligence sources, about the potential for firearms to be used against police. And it certainly became clear that there were firearms in the vicinity. Tensions had risen very quickly. Police, observers, children, journalists, politicians, all on the street and all crammed into a small area between residential and commercial buildings. Some people were on the roofs throwing missiles. Petrol bombs had been thrown, so people were doused in petrol. It was a very dangerous combination, and cars were on fire. There were random groups of spectators much closer than you would believe, and they'd come from nearby homes, and nearby homes were threatened by the fires. I saw children as young as 13 milling about in the midst of it all. Police came under serious attack. Now, they had authorized and deployed water cannon, baton rounds, taser, and live ammunition. And it seemed, even to me, who was always instinctively against the use of force, it seemed highly unlikely they wouldn't have to resort to all of them to protect themselves and others. I was sure fatalities were moments away, and my heart was nearly jumping out of my chest. I watched as that police commander, who I'd seen previously in training rooms and making decisions and planning for this operation, how he went through various rights at issue, balanced them, what seemed masterfully to me, reached decisions and issued directions over the police radio. And that tension was de-escalated very quickly. Force became unnecessary. And I'm not saying that's always going to be the case. There are going to be times when force is necessary and lawful and proportionate. But on this occasion, his thinking and his way of reaching operational decisions really did influence what happened on the streets that night. The incident passed and no one died. My knees were absolutely shaking, knocking. Goodness only knows what sort of knocking was going on in that commander. But he had no time, and this was the essential importance, I think, of the role. He had no time to put on performance for me or anybody else. He didn't trot out the language of rights. His decision-making was shaped squarely by his understanding of human rights. And I asked him sometime later, obviously when the worst was over, whether human rights observance, which is what you often read in the papers or hear some politicians speaking of, whether human rights observance had made the process more difficult for him. And he said quite forcefully, it made it easier. It's like a mind map. He added another occasion, if I'm not actively protecting human rights and capable of balancing all the competing rights during public disorder, I have no business being here. He then added, in any event, it sort of works. It's quite practical and common sense what we're doing. Now, the next day, despite that exceptional leadership that I saw, his command decisions were criticized by the media and by politicians for being, in quotes, too soft. People had all sorts of ideas. They knew what was better, and snatch squads and all sorts of things. Opening fire was suggested. People who hadn't been there had a myriad of opinions as to what the police should have done. Because I'd been there and had access to all the information and decision making and knew what the intelligence picture was, I was able to revert to the policing board and say, relax, think about this before you go to the press. Have a proper briefing, hear what happened, and let me tell you about the human rights exercise that was conducted and hear from the police directly. And on that occasion, the fact of independent observation, which assessed policing against human rights, proved reassuring both for the police and the public. And I think the policing board, it certainly enabled a greater understanding of public order policing. The other opinions voiced across the media dried up pretty quickly, and all members of the board united on that occasion to support the policing approach. So I saw directly how proving compliance with human rights, proving that it matters and that you're prepared to stick to it and stand up and be counted, really does make a difference to people. That night, human rights helped everyone, including maybe even particularly so the police. And what I saw at the board was the majority, not all, the majority of officers were people who wanted to contribute to society and protect everyone from harm. I also learned, however, about the potential abuse of power. To enable police to protect us from harm, to protect society from destabilization by those determined to subvert the rule of law, the police are equipped with powers, many of which are highly intrusive. They're authorized to use force against us. They can deprive us of our liberty. And to balance that, there is a critical need for oversight. The oversight must be according to agreed principles, and I would suggest we have none better than human rights principles, with which the overseers are also bound to comply. And I think that's a very important other bit that's often missed. We should support the police, we must support the police, but not by closing our eyes or ears to bad practice or alleged criminality. Instead, what a human rights approach does is say to the police, and is played out in the public, we expect the best of you, we expect that you can maintain order and combat crime while also protecting and respecting human rights. And when it's taught properly, that's exactly what it does. To expect any less is to do them and us a great disservice, and to resign ourselves to an antiquated, militaristic policing regime pitching itself against the public rather than serving the public. Now, I'm old enough to remember those days. I don't want to go back to them. And neither do the police, was my experience. We are supposed to be a liberal democracy in which the police are a civilian service, policing by consent, consent bestowed by and for the benefit of the public. And we've surrendered to the state and the police enormous control over our lives. And we do so with certain conditions, that they will act within the law, that they will protect and respect our fundamental rights, that they will not discriminate against any individual or group, and that they will be transparent and accountable. And that is the bargain we make with them. And that was something Stephen really brought home to me. There is a bargain, and lawyers can be really important in holding people to their promises, including the police, who seem sometimes too strong and vast to be able to take on at all. But what's happening now, and this is what really does worry me and sort of disappoints and depresses me even, instead of being grateful to the police when they do comply, when they see their role as a protective one, as human rights champions, fingers are now being pointed, jokes are being made, and they're accused of being woke, which seems to be one of the worst things you can call anybody nowadays. In my view, what made policing reform in Northern Ireland successful was the fact that there was support, jubilance even at the start. So there were a lot of people, again, I see them in this room, really behind this policing reform programme, and the police got behind it. Everyone felt good about peace. Human rights are for everyone, and we put real effort into making it work. But instead, it seems to be a figure of fun, or at least potentially going that way. Back then, nobody disparaged the efforts of the police. We supported genuine reform. Those, almost all, some exceptions which I need not draw attention to, but involved in policing, backed the human rights approach. They committed resources to it, engaged help to revise policy, training, operational practice, established oversight and accountability mechanisms, which had a renewed focus on providing transparency and accountability to the public by the collection, analysis and publication of statistics, policy documents and operational decisions. Now I leave it to other people to judge whether that's still the case, but I worry that may no longer be the case. Maybe not intentionally, but that may be what we're giving up. So just to finish with policing, as my illustration of the importance of human rights, I'm going to direct you to a few senior police officers. So I want to share the words of, very briefly, but the words of two Northern Ireland Chief Constables and the current Chief of the National Police Chiefs Council. I'm going to start with Hugh Ord. He wasn't a man I started just as he was finishing as Chief Constable. He's not a man I would say was very woke, certainly not too woke. But having returned to GB, having been Chief Constable, he was President of the Association of Chief Police Officers, and he called for a radical shake-up, and I'm quoting, in British policing, particularly in public order tactics and training, to put more emphasis on the consideration of human rights. In his words, he was keen to dispel the myth that human rights prevent good policing. He said, "A concern for human rights helps us in our policing. It's not an impediment to policing, it makes you think of other solutions." He then was asked to give evidence to the Westminster Parliament's Home Affairs Select Committee and offered a practical example. And this was an example that I'd read about because it preceded me by a year, I think. But I hadn't been there, so it's interesting to hear directly from him. What he says was, disorder at one parade in Belfast was so violent my officers had to return fire, but the following year it was policed by just 2 officers in shirt sleeves as a result of a radical re-examination of tactics with consideration of human rights at its core. Then, and I did have direct observation of this Chief Constable, George Hamilton, but in November 2016, in a speech to mark 15 years of the PSNI, he reflected on the circumstances faced by his officers then, including the ongoing threat to police and policing partners from violent, and that he described violent extremists, continuing divisions within society and diminishing resources. They were his threats at the time. but he restated his belief. He said accountability, openness and transparency around our decision-making becomes all the more important in responding under challenging circumstances. He said publicly that such close scrutiny improved his service, and this was scrutiny, and I flatter myself a little bit that he was talking about some of what I did, but certainly what the policing board members did, and helped build community confidence. He described the human rights reviews that the board carried out as the annual health checks that he came to rely upon. Well, he went on fundamental building blocks for community confidence on the delivery of effective policing or human rights and accountability. He added a constant factor in all our decision-making will continue to be a core focus on human rights. I'm going to finish his quote. I know it's going on a little bit long. He continued, accountability and human rights are the foundations for effective policing. And as we reflect back over the last 15 years, I think we can be proud of how we built on these strong foundations. The result has been a transformation in policing and a broad acceptance of the policing structures across the community that we serve. And this is the key bit, I think, probably. He addressed expressly the protection of human rights in the context of a real security threat and said, the fact that Northern Ireland is a unique policing environment is not a reason to step away from human rights policing. Rather, the greater the challenges faced by the police service, the more important human rights policing becomes. He finished, the critical success story from a policing perspective has been the full implementation of the human rights framework. And he didn't have to say any of that. His promotion didn't depend on that. He was giving his honest opinion, and it didn't go down well in all corners. It was not said in the rosy afterglow of the peace process. It was said with an enduring threat to his officers. Police were still patrolling in armoured vehicles. They were still routinely armed. They were still checking under their cars for bombs. And they would have to consider, and I became acutely aware of this when I was doing a piece of work on domestic violence, but they had to consider whether a report was intended to lure them into a booby trap. And you may or may not remember one officer was killed responding to a domestic violence report, which was a booby trap. I also just want to add, I'm going to, maybe this is a little defensive of me, but I may not get another chance. Despite what Patton found, a number of commentators who objected to the notion of a human rights advisor being anywhere near the police talked about how he and she interfered with operations. In my particular case, I think, well, I'll leave it to you to decide. In my particular case, the words snooping and disrupting were used, and lefty liberal notions would have us all cowering at home was how human rights people and human rights messing around in the work of the police where it might get us. But let me just say this in case I say I don't have another chance. The police came, not because it was me, but the police came to welcome observation and attendance of somebody independent, not because I would advise them or speak for them. That I certainly didn't do. Quite often, actually, I had to criticize. But because an independent person was willing to experience their decision-making in real time and would report fairly and fully on what happened, they saw that as actually very protective. They knew it could expose them sometimes to criticism and to risk of things getting out into the public domain, but they, on balance, preferred the fact that somebody could actually report independently, and it did them a very good service, they would say. They had developed a very sophisticated human rights approach to public order, and they were rightly proud of it, but they didn't really mean as much when they said it themselves. They had struggled to explain their approach, continued to hear politicians arguing, as I said, over their tactics, but they were now able to say in good conscience, let somebody else judge, we'll give access to everything and let them and the policing board decide. They can then report to the public. And close analysis actually did them a favour most of the time. It did a great service. It restored confidence in public order policing. They didn't always get it right, far from it, but then who does? And the board was able to say that on behalf of the police, was able to say, not everyone gets this right, but this is what actually happened, not what you think might have happened. It does also, this sort of oversight and accountability, make it much more likely that the public and the courts will defer to the police exercising their discretion. So if police and the state and the government want police to be able to exercise their discretion, make sure you have safeguards in place, because very soon that discretion may be abused and the public won't buy it. It's a little bit of protesting too much about that, but it certainly was. I met a police officer just a couple of days ago who did bounce up and say, you know, it was quite good having you in the room because we never knew what to say to anybody, but you were able to say honestly that we weren't that bad. Coming back to date, up to date, I promised you a current chief, and this is chair of the National Police Chiefs Council, Chief Constable Martin Hewitt. Now, he felt compelled in the last couple of weeks to reject the claims by the Home Secretary, and instead said this approach to policing was simply his approach to policing. He was accused, I think, of #1 woke police officer. Good common sense, it's good policing, nothing more or less. And while it's imperfect, nobody's going to suggest otherwise. Currently in need of some extra attention. If there's one thing that should be, they should commend a human rights approach to each of us and make us care about the attempts to deride the concept, it's the Northern Ireland reform of policing. It was effective. It secured legitimacy, it increased confidence in and cooperation with the police, restored order and protected democracy. And thereafter, it's much easier to enjoy rights to education, health, free expression, dignity, and equality, all the other things I'd like to be talking to you about today. All of us old enough to remember can say without much contradiction that few rights are enjoyed against a backdrop of fear and violence. We're facing that uncertainty again around the world and at home. The cost of living crisis, health service that is buckling, Russian aggression in Ukraine, the climate change crisis, to name but a few. Seems to me, when we need to restore our faith in human dignity and protect those weaker than ourselves, society might just be moving further away from democracy and risks throwing out all the gains of the human rights approach that we embraced not very long ago. And just to make clear, speaking of democracy, what I'm speaking about isn't blind imposition of the will of the majority. That's something completely different. And in fact, that's very anti-democratic. It should be surely a vision of democracy enshrined in human rights, or as Baroness Hale put it in her 2004 opinion in the Gaydon case, democracy secures the protection of the essential rights of members of minority groups, even when they are unpopular with the majority. That's the version of democracy I certainly aspire to, and I think human rights is the only way of delivering it. I love her explanation in that case. Democracy values everyone equally, even if the majority does not. And that's very much was Stephen's message to me all those years ago. So I'm getting very close to the end. I'm finishing up. You don't have very much longer to wait. I want to explain, I think, justify why I've chosen to open myself to being called pessimistic, negative even, which is being lobbed against me a lot recently. It's not because I think all is lost. I certainly don't think that. I think there's a lot to be optimistic about, but I think it could be if we don't face up to what is happening at the moment. And I include my own current organisation in that. For example, we have, I talked about proposed legislation that really is troubling. It does point to a direction of travel that we should all be concerned about. Let me mention just very briefly the legacy bill. Now, the Commission has already said to government what our professional, and it is a professional view of the bill is. It's not just an opinion. And that advice is in the public domain. But the headline from that advice was that whatever democratic means are found to secure the interests of victims in society, and that's not for us, me to judge. It must be respectful of the rule of law, and that must include the state's human rights obligations. That's all we're asking, and I don't think that's a lot to ask. It's my view that the current proposals do not do that. One justification for this, what must be seen as a radical departure from the rule of law, is that what we euphemistically call the past here is getting in the way of modern policing, that it's driving the police and community apart, and therefore we need to draw a line in the sand. My view of that, from seeing it up close, and I really have seen this up close, I've met many of the families bereaved and still grieving as a result of loss during the conflict. The only thing that's really going to achieve that separation and then a retraction back is when confidence in the state is lost, when the state becomes selective in how it protects itself and its machinery, when it becomes selective in what obligations it will comply with and those which are too difficult, which will put to one side for the time being. The public aren't stupid. They get it, they see it. They may not have the language of the European Convention or the Human Rights Act, but they know exactly what they're seeing. And certainly if the PSNI are to enjoy the benefits of enhanced confidence, continue to enjoy those benefits that they worked hard for, they've learned, and I think they're right, that they must apply all of the rights all of the time to all of the people. They can't pick and choose. And now, I'm sure somebody will say, you fundamentally misunderstood. There's no such thing as all the rights all the time to all the people. But what I'm talking about there is within the boundaries of the convention itself, so as interpreted. So sometimes one person's rights may be taken more seriously than another. That's probably not the best way to put it. But there is balance here, and some rights aren't absolute, such. I'm not going to go into a whole, I could get lost in a whole lecture on that, but taking all of that into account, the state must respect its obligations. If it doesn't, who else is going to respect theirs? And I know that's a trite thing to say, it's maybe even a little corny, but I'm surprised at how often I have to keep restating it. Sometimes with blank faces in some of the other jobs I do in quieter rooms. I do fear that what's happened is that the substantive part of Article 2, if you want to put it that way, the right to life itself in the convention, only that bit is really considered and honoured in practice. You could almost say that two elements of Article 2, the substantive right to protection of right and the procedural right to investigation following suspicious death, are being played off against each other. And that was never supposed to be the case. It was supposed to, they were supposed to empower each other. It was supposed to give meaning to the substantive right. I hear too often the substantive right being used. And this is where I think policing is maybe not doing quite so well at the moment, but I say from an outsider's view. The substantive right is used as the reason for not taking action or for breaching other rights, for not disclosing information to the public, for secrecy surrounding inquiries and court proceedings. I'm hearing that an awful lot, and I'm hearing that more now in my work with the Human Rights Commission. The state has got to remember that the right to life is meaningless without a commensurate obligation to investigate. If they fail to uphold Article 2 rights, confidence in them will disintegrate. The new beginning will become an historical footnote. Every positive report of human rights compliance and community policing, and that is still positive as I understand it, will be met with, yes, but look what they're doing over here. Resentment and harm to police public relations has been caused already by the failure to resolve what are called legacy cases. And that's escalated, according to victims groups who really know, in the wake of the latest legacy bill. So I really urge government to listen to what other people, not me, but listen to what other people are telling you, people who've experienced this, and the people that you say you're trying to reconcile. This undermining, once it happens, really can take hold, and it infects everything. And once that starts to happen, then we really are in difficult straits. What seems to be happening for short-term political gain is that certain groups are demonized, stories are shared that make us afraid of our local or international neighbors, stories that make us believe that anyone who gets something is at our expense. They're harming and risking and causing threat to us and our family. And that's when things start to get really, I think, worrying. And we really can start to lose our way. Couple all of that with the reality of the Bill of Rights bill. Now this, not the Northern Ireland Bill of Rights, this was something completely different. In fact, this started off being called a British Bill of Rights, but it seeks to replace the Human Rights Act. And in my view, having read it quite a few times, it will only diminish protection. It will drive a wedge through the principle of universality and significantly weaken the right to remedy before courts. Those promises essentially that were enshrined in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and they now are looking quite fragile. And I do wonder, I really hope I'm wrong, but I wonder, have we got to that place where one right or rights holder is sacrificed at the expense of another, where one person's rights are considered subservient to another? And it's difficult to read, I think, the Bill of Rights bill and some of the other commentary at the minute without having to at least consider that that is a possibility. So even though I didn't know, I understand Karen is watching, hopefully she's warm and tucked up. I didn't know Stephen terribly well, but I can tell you that he made a huge impression on me over a few short meetings and opened my eyes to what the law could and should be about. He believed, I know, that if you abandon a right, if you abandon any of the rights, you abandon them all. And if you overlook one person, you overlook us all. Thank you so much for coming this evening. It's absolutely bitterly cold out there, and I'm sure you're all keen to get a drink when this is over. But I do just want to thank you for listening for about the right time, I think I was told. But most importantly, I think for being here to honour Stephen and his family. His parents couldn't join us, which is a shame. But I hope somebody relays to them at least one of those wide-eyed, very unpolished, very uncertain young people who was terrified of her own shadow, actually has his career now in law because of Stephen. And he was the main force behind it. So thank you, Mo, and everyone else watching, and Karen. I do hope you'll join me in thanking Stephen for everything he contributed. It's lovely to have had the opportunity to do that myself. Thank you very much.
That was a tour de force. Thank you so much. So Alyson, I think you're happy to take some questions, I hope. So online, I'm hoping also that we might be able to take some questions. Please do, if any come. So for those that are listening online, if you can perhaps most easily use the chat function, and I'll be able to field those as well. Thanks, Declan. Questions, Colin.
Thank you very much, Alyson, for a wonderful, fantastic lecture. And I can say Stephen would be very, very proud of you. Absolutely fantastic. Obviously, a theme in the lecture was rather pessimistic about the current climate we're in. And maybe it might be helpful to bring it back to the Human Rights Commission, which you mentioned. Obviously, people worked very, very hard to ensure that there's an effective Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission in place. And one of the many attacks, really, on human rights and equality that is being very much led by this government in London, I'll be as diplomatic as I can be in relation to that, is really undermining your own organization to the extent that your accreditation at the UN is at risk. So in the spirit of and thinking about everybody in the room and the tremendous support there is for really an effective human rights culture here, and as director of the Human Rights Centre and the links that we all have on this, I suppose a question I have is how can we, in a sense, as a sort of human rights community, help to ensure that people who really are intent on, like we often talk about the ceiling and the floor, like they're just essentially taking the floorboards out at the moment, you know? So you're trying to hold on to that. I suppose my question is, how can people who support a robust human rights culture here help?
Well, thank you for caring enough to ask. That's probably the other hidden reason why I'm so pessimistic. The organisation is set up to ensure human rights compliance, to advise, to hold government to account, to take proceedings if necessary, has been stripped of its resources to such an extent that we are not able to be fully independent and to discharge the functions given to us by Parliament. That's all I want to do as Chief Commissioner with my colleagues, is to fulfil the obligations given to us and promised in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, plus all those additional ones that are given to us, by the way, ever since then. Times are hard, there is a cost of living crisis, all of those things. I know it doesn't play out well when you ask for money, but the Commission has been deprived of resources to such an extent over so many years that what we are now looking at is not having money at all to do our job, certainly not properly, certainly not independently. So I think what is missing is the sort of hearts and minds, why it matters. The government doesn't think that people are really going to care if the Commission disappears. And that might possibly partly be our own fault, because maybe we haven't made the connection for people and said why human rights are make a difference in their lives. And I'm very keen to do that over the next few years to try and show the practical impact. But at the minute, I do fear that if we go simply into the public domain and say there might not be a Human Rights Commission next year, I don't know how many people are going to care terribly. So I think it's people like yourselves who know the history, know what it is we're supposed to be doing, continues to speak up. We are going through an independent review, which we called for as like a last ditch attempt. And that we will have our report within a week or two. So depending on what comes out of that. But if we're not to be funded, I think people need to make clear how important that is. Unless we're not doing our jobs as well as we could, and then tell us that as well. And certainly.
This gentleman here. Could you introduce yourself as well?
Hi, my name is Richard. It's just a question. Do you think that the British government have broken the social contract, and therefore do they have moral authority to rule, and should there be a general election?
I'm staying out of politics. I know law is directly linked to politics, and human rights are political, I know, but I did promise myself and my colleagues at the Commission that when I took over the role, I was going to avoid saying anything which could be construed as political. What I would say is, I think, I'm not sure I shied away from it when I was speaking a minute ago. What I would say is that there is a contract and it's a two-way process, and it all seems to be going in one direction at the minute. So
Richard.
Thanks, Chris. Richard English, Director of the Mitchell Institute here at Queen's. Thank you for a brilliant lecture. You spoke eloquently in the lecture about the ways in which politicians are using the accusation of wokery, which is a common thing within the UK, but it's not unique to the UK. It's a liberal democratic practice which has become frequently familiar. And I think very frequently those politicians are doing it because they think it's going to get them instrumental rewards in terms of votes and support from certain constituencies. You touched on this in your answer to Colin's question, but could you say a little bit more about it, about the problems that there, I think, have been across many liberal democracies, despite the enormous progress to which you rightly referred, the problems there have been in winning sufficient hearts and minds across the continuum of political and social views, and why that is, because it seems to me that the arguments about human rights being valuable for people of different political hue and different regional backgrounds and different economic backgrounds is a very strong set of arguments. And yet there is something where newspaper headlines and politicians wanting to offer a soundbite and potential presidential candidates trying to get re-elected or whatever see this as a vote winner in ways that are quasi-automatic. Could you say something about why there is that hearts and minds issue that the human rights sympathetic community faces?
I think, well, part of it is, I think that human rights have been dishonestly described as one thing when they're something completely different. So something which I'm loath to come up to actually give you an individual example, because that will subject me to the wokery and I'll be fending off all sorts of things in the mail. But take some of the current social economic debates that are going on about rights. People overstate what human rights requires in those situations. So when people are under with cost of living crisis, or they feel that they're losing out to somebody else, it's a very easy thing to just say human rights is doing all this to you. Human rights, and something that's just sort of, it's not, they don't really know what it is, but it sounds like it's somebody getting something for nothing. Certainly those people who don't deserve it. So it's about raising awareness and really making people understand what it is, what human rights really, what we're talking about when we say human rights, what they are. It's about the woman with mental health problems and a child not being kicked out of her council flat because she's had a period of ill health. You know, it's about getting access to an emergency room, not being stuck in the back of an ambulance for so long. It's about children getting an education. It's all those things, but it's never talked about like that. It's talked about instead about maybe sexual rights, reproductive rights in the States, what you're talking about, and not even those properly. I'm really desperately trying to show how human rights are practical. And we're using every opportunity to get out into schools. We're going everywhere we possibly can, but the impact of a reduced budget is that our capacity to even do that is slipping away. So it seems just at a time when we're, really sort of refocusing on what we need to be doing, and what we need to be doing is messaging and convincing people and just getting them to see why it's important. We don't have the capacity to do it. And as we try and be more and more practical, we have no budget left to take legal cases. You know, so, and it's through litigation often that you show what the practical effect is.
Kieran McAvoy, I work here in Queens. Alyson, thank you for a brilliant lecture. I think it's the second time I've heard you in 3 days doing a lecture, and this one was just as good as the last one. So no, that was a comment and then a question. I think the example you gave of real-time police officers making really difficult, balanced, nuanced, professional judgments and the utility of human rights in that is a brilliant one. I think that really captures, and that just communicating that to people. What human rights gives you is a framework to make complicated decisions, but to make them as effectively as you can, you know, and the fact that the police themselves have become proponents of that, very loud proponents of it. And I've been on panels where I've heard Hugh Ward saying exactly the same thing, that it made their job easier.
Yeah.
And I think that's for anybody involved in any aspect of public life, you know, any decision-making process, it's a framework within which you can make nuanced, complicated decisions. And I think that was a beautiful illustration of precisely that. One of the things that's happening with the kind of whole anti-woke stuff is the glorification of stupidity, you know. It is the vulgarization.
And I quite like it.
It really is, but it is like it's everything reduced to 140 characters. And it's that, you know, it's people setting the politics who stand on bins and shout, you know, that's where we're at. And that, so I think one of the ways framing human rights as this is where grown-ups have conversations. These are the frameworks which in really difficult decisions get made. So anyway, that's a comment. My question is this: you've talked already about the dangers of the British Bill of Rights, or whatever they're terming it now, for different aspects. One of the things as you were speaking, I was thinking of, what impact do you think it would have on the judiciary? I mean, the judiciary have been another one of the institutions here in the transition that I think are very well respected. You know, they have come out of the transition very well. And I'm wondering what implications you think the proposed Bill of Rights would have on the work of the judiciary as actors in our society.
I'm conscious that the Chief Justice is sitting in front of me. He should be welcoming her and acknowledging her position.
I'm not in practice anymore, so I can say what I like without any sort of fear. So this is my honest assessment. Most members of the judiciary have done absolutely brilliant work in Northern Ireland, in the face of all sorts of things, and Our Lady Chief Justice no less than anybody else. And I think they, a bit like the police, they have taken what can be quite intellectual concepts at times and translated them into outcomes in cases. So they're seeing the people, they're seeing all this every day, and they're making decisions. And I think doing it pretty well. And I think they've got so used to being able to use that framework as well that I think they may miss, I don't know, may miss not being able to carry on. I mean, one of the one of the cases that Commission is particularly proud of recently was the access zones case. It was a reference to the Supreme Court. But that was one of those situations where human rights had to be balanced, all sorts of other competing interests, very sensitive topics. And the judges, I thought, brilliantly just set out how we can balance these things. And Our Lady Chief Justice was on that judgment. So I think we've still got, when I was talking to some Canova families, Canova is the steak knife investigations, and they were saying, oh, everyone's let us down, the government don't want us anymore. I mean, but one woman, and she was 94, I think, she said, we've still got the judges. We've still got the judges there on our side. And it was just after the Ballymurphy inquest report. Again, I'm not picking them just because you're here. But that was really vital to them. They thought, well, if all else fails, we'll go to court. But of course, there are restrictions on our ability to go to court now as well. Civil legal aid doesn't pay what it should, and et cetera, et cetera. I could go on and be really, really pessimistic. But we have a really good judge here. I don't know if...
Just maybe to follow up with what you said, Kieran, I think myself, if you look at the structure of the Human Rights Act, we're back to actually realizing what the powers are within it, obviously to read down, which judges have done. Judges also can make declarations of incompatibility, which happen, but not on, a particularly regular basis, because we can interpret law to be a human rights compliant. So the fear in relation to judicial overreach, I think, has probably been overstated in the past. But that, I think, Alyson has tapped into the fact that there is an infrastructure now which is very much in place, which allows independent judiciary, which is very important, to look at rights-based arguments and practically apply. So we're not talking every day of the week about the high-level cases which affect large bodies of people. We're talking about individual cases which have been very important, which are not actually something that are often in the press, but matter to people. But so that's just a comment in relation to the role of the judiciary, which I think has been very important. And obviously there's a line drawn between law and policy, which the Act sets out very clearly in terms of powers. But one thing you mentioned, which I think is interesting, it brings me back to the McDermott lecture, which I sat and listened to here, that Chief O'Leary gave, now President of the European Court, was this issue of the world we live in is now driven by social media and comment, and how you deal with what she called the potential for misinformation and how you regulate, because that seems to be part of the issue here in terms of the debate about human rights. She was talking about it in the context of Article 10 and freedom of expression. But I wondered what you thought about that. So that's the context and the milieu for the rights-based discussion at the moment is related to our world and how we communicate.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. And it almost feels like it's too much.
Yeah.
There's no way of pushing back against it. But I think we just have to. We have to keep going. But what has happened is in areas and in places where people should know better, one opinion is just as good as the next. And people who are making decisions are accepting any old opinion. They're disrespecting it. It goes back to what you were saying, Kieran, disrespecting the idea of professionalism or expertise. You're almost ashamed to say, I actually might know a bit about this. I mean, certainly some of what I said about the legacy bill was just your opinion, isn't it? Well, yes, it is, I suppose, just my opinion, but it's legally informed, I hope, after years of experience, you know, so it's not just any old feeling about the matter. But people think that you're just, I don't know what the answer is yet. We do have comms people in the commission, but they're also struggling, you know, they're trying to use the best they can of social media. We do little films and things, but people need to choose to go on and look at those. It's much more exciting to read all the salacious stuff, isn't it?
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Rowan Wise. I do a bit of work for an academic journal. I was going to ask you first a comment, I suppose, that you know, the woke sort of mention of woke politics. I mean, that and the attempt to say that it's all sort of on the one side, if you like. I mean, woke politics and as an all-consuming movement that is, I don't think, much aligned with liberalism, in my particular opinion. And I think it can itself become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and rather, I would say, in itself, it's somewhat dangerous ideology. I should think. I think there's evidence there for that, as well as, and I think also people who are woke and who claim to be progressive can say some very uninformed things. But I noticed during your lecture, I picked up on a word militaristic to describe policing of a former generation. Obviously, it's not one of us in this room who wouldn't know people of the generation who lived through the 30 years of terrorism. And I get the impression that there's almost the sense that when you talk about militaristic police forces and you use language like that, there's almost an attempt to kind of blame the police, as it was then, for causing violence and disorder, rather than tracing the route back to the violence and disorder being something the police had to deal with and then had to militarize in order to protect itself and protect civilians. And then the final point I wanted to ask, just a clarification on that. And then the final point is really a question, I suppose. The Burkean concept of conservatism much allied to personal liberty, and the idea of a police force as being the British concept here in the United Kingdom of a police force as being a citizen not above the law, but a citizen brought in to protect the law, sort of a first among equals, if you like, not the European concept of a gendarmerie, an officer of the state enacting a Code Napoleon. So what do you say to the argument that it is it is the British policing system that is much aligned with liberty and personal independence, and that this is much removed from a Code Napoleon system, as such as I would reference the arguments in by Peter Hitchens and the abolition of liberty in relation to that, and what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
There's quite a lot there. Can I
choose what you want?
Yeah, can I defend myself first in relation to what you said about woke people? Can also say some truly awful things. I don't disagree with you. I've done it myself, I know I have. But what I'm talking about is the state using an argument against something that is there for the protection of the public. That's all I mean. It's not a sort of trade-off between the left and the right, because they can both cause mischief and sometimes intentionally. Referring to the police as militaristic, that was in Patton's language, and I think they were, and I think they thought they were as well, and they didn't want to be anymore. So it's not drawing any, I'm not making any assumptions about who started what, whether the militaristic paraphernalia approach was a response to something, whether that was a response to the militaristic style of policing. All I'm saying is we don't have it anymore. And the reason we don't have it anymore, in my view, is human rights approach to policing. And the police are better off as a result of it. Much better off as a result of not being a militaristic force, and we're much better off as a result of it. So it doesn't, I'm not interested in who started it. All I'm interested in is we're in a better place now and why we're in a better place. The last, what was the last bit? What have I missed? Have I missed the most important bit?
It actually was, yes, because I'm really interested in your thoughts on this very interesting lecture. I'm much interested in your thoughts on the sort of discrepancy and how that would work today between, in a sense, the sort of the original police, the peelers, or and the Bow Street runners. You know, an idea of a citizen brought in rather than from the top down, because I think that's maybe another issue now, is this sort of an almost European approach to policing, which is top down, or sort of taking over from the traditional British approach to policing, which is first among equals, the sort of police force of the people, for the people.
I'm not sure the two are necessarily mutually exclusive. You can have, I mean, you're going to have a hierarchy within policing. You've got to, somebody's going to make the decisions ultimately and take responsibility, and they delegate down and down and down and down. And the police are actually pretty good at doing that, delegating and having their own hierarchy that they stick by. But they are civilian, and that's the truth of it. They are civilian, and ever since, I mean, I'm very fond of the Robert Peel list of principles of policing. You know, that was a long time ago, and I can't fault them now when you look at them, because they're not, we have an army, they're not the army, they are a civilian force, and we appoint them, and they have powers over us.
Thank you, Alyson, for your lecture. Peter Donnelly, graduate from Queen's. There's somewhat an unfortunate propensity to delve into politics tonight. So to conform with that, I'm going to ask about the protocol, the Northern Ireland Protocol. The Commission has responsibilities under the protocol, I believe. Could you maybe tell us what they are exactly?
Well, we've just released a paper on the scope of protocol. The Article 2 bit is the bit that we're interested in, which is the no diminution in rights and also keeping pace with some equality directives. We are with the Equality Commission to oversee that, so we have to monitor it, advise, take court proceedings, bit like what we do with our other work. We do now in relation to the protocol. That aspect of the protocol is completely outside of politics so far. It's been said by everybody to be non-controversial. They aren't going to touch it. So we're ploughing on. We're taking that at face value. We're taking them at their word. We're going to continue to monitor and advise, and we'll take issues to court if we have to. I mean, we have a team, a really good team. Some of them are here actually, who are working on the protocol, and we have Evelyn Collins here. Unfortunately, we're about to lose her in a month or two, but heading up the dedicated mechanism on the protocol. We think Article 2 could be even better, but we think it's pretty good in protecting rights post-Brexit. But we also have a man here who's a bit of an expert. So do you want to?
Absolutely not.
Patrick Horrigan from Amnesty International. Alyson, thank you for that great lecture. Every year I find the Stephen Livingstone lecture inspires me for another year of human rights campaigning, and this year was no exception. So thanks for that. You were at pains to tell us that you were sort of somewhat pessimistic, apologised for being pessimistic about the human rights climate, and obviously it was with good reason. The undermining of the Commission, the Legacy Bill, the Bill of Rights Bill, the Public Order Act we've seen recently, and many more that we could name. And obviously it's not by accident, it's by design by this government or successive versions of this government over recent years. But I wanted to maybe invite you to be optimistic as well, and see if you could find some positivity to share with us this evening as well. I think there's lots out there in my work, looking at some of this devolution across the board. I see in Scotland and Wales governments moving progressively on human rights to incorporate international human rights standards and treaties into devolved law to better protect their citizens. And even closer to home, I know we have a dysfunctional politic, but before it collapsed earlier this year, we saw, I think, 4 of the 5 main Assembly parties rowing in behind at least some version of a Northern Ireland Bill of Rights, and we now have majorities in the Assembly, because we have majorities and have had for years in the public behind reproductive rights, LGBT rights, language rights, and other areas where we've seen good progress. So I wanted to invite you to give us some reasons to be cheerful.
Well, you've just given us them. Thank you. No, I mean, it's not. I think you have to be truthful. And at the minute, I am not optimistic about the picture, about what we're being given, what we're being asked to deal with. That doesn't mean I don't think there's any hope. There's absolutely hope. And just Kieran was talking about, I had to speak the other day on 25 years post Good Friday Agreement. I do feel there's sort of a growing support, maybe, realization of where we are, and support for refocusing on Good Friday Agreement, what the point of it was, the centrality of human rights, all of those things. So I think this could actually spur us into a lot of very positive action again. But I'm not going to be an apologist. It's not my job to find optimism. It's my job to point out where things are going wrong and where human rights are at risk. I would love to be able to come back and do 40 minutes of optimism. I really would, because there is lots of stuff, and you mentioned most of it. Reproductive rights, for example, the Spuck case that we've just had, all really positive, all based on human rights arguments. So it's not dead and buried yet, but I don't want us to sort of that expression, sleepwalk into it.
There's a question from the chat, which is fairly basic. Thank you. The question from the chat, which is, how do we hold the authorities to account?
Well, we can take them to court, obviously. That should be left to the very extreme situations. I think when all else has failed, we can campaign in relation to policy. If people want to change policy, get out there and campaign, get involved in politics, even though I'm not involved in politics. Make your voices heard. I think that's what changes things, when people agree that that's what they want.
Thank you. Maybe we could now move into, there's 2 more questions. Maybe we take 2 more, and then we'll.
Thank you, David Heresy. Thank you for an inspiring lecture and indeed discussion. I wonder whether or not what has been needed since the Human Rights Act is a cultural shift. You recall, no doubt, that I think there was a very long period of 2 years between the passing of the Human Rights Act and the fully coming into force of it. And you'll probably recall, because you were practicing at that time, that what happened during that period probably was a cultural shift, but maybe it was restricted to practitioners, academics, judges, and public authorities. And perhaps it didn't deal with a cultural shift in relation to citizens and matters of that nature. And I understand in countries that have longer traditions and fully codified written conventions, such as the United States, not a very good example at the moment, but in any event, for many decades, I think there's been in its education system a strong element of human rights, constitutional norms, understanding what they mean from a very early age. And therefore, when you get to a stage where as has already been alluded to, there is a huge amount of misinformation and a swirl of opinions and very short views and reactionary sometimes opinions in this Twitter sphere and elsewhere, Daily Mail and so on and so forth. Then people really don't know where they stand. They don't have perhaps the information, the education to form a view on fundamental rights, for example. The Commission could perhaps blow its budget, in its current budget, in a week, trying to educate people, trying to get out to schools and so forth. How is this to happen belatedly? How is this ever to happen? How is that cultural shift ever going to take place down to the level of all of the citizens?
Schools, I'm guessing, is going to make a big difference. Teach children. We do go into schools, but that takes a lot of time and money as well. But children are going to make the difference. They need to really understand what's going on. And what's slightly bizarre is that the accusation often made is that people are too familiar with their human rights, not enough with their responsibilities. It's just not the case. People don't know what are and what aren't rights that they can actually claim. But it is education. I mean, we can try and harness social media, which is cheap. And we're trying to find better ways of doing that, I think, and better ways of getting into schools. So maybe we'll do more social media things in schools rather than have to send a body of people out. We're still looking at that. But you're right. I mean, it's not going to, this is going to, even if we weather this storm, it's going to keep coming back if we can't change people's, at least knowledge. At least then they can choose whether they like it or don't like it. But at the minute, they dislike it. But what they're disliking is not what's there. You know, that's the difficulty.
Okay, may we then move into the more informal phase, when we can have discussion and maybe even a drink downstairs. So on behalf of all of us, may I ask you to join with me in thanking Alyson for a wonderful discussion. Alyson, thank you very much indeed.